Welcome to Fields of Consciousness, the podcast for consciousness conversations with me, your host, Jeffrey Stegman, and
Clayten Stedman.
As consciousness explorers and founders of Focus Life Force Energy, we're here to bring a holistic approach to consciousness and to share practical examples of how you can take your life to the next level. From your thoughts to your spooky Halloween parties, let's explore together how consciousness interacts with your everyday experiences.
In this episode, we have our Halloween special, as we have discussed some spooky subjects such as hauntings and curses. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, everyone. This episode is released in October, close to Halloween and other traditions concerned with the dead, what's called hauntings and disembodied spirits. So, Clayten, what's up with that? What are the thought forms and consciousness fields, as we've talked about in other episodes related to these holidays?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we were planning for this, we were looking at what are the influences that contribute to these ceremonies or celebrations at the end of the year. At the end of the year, I say that because that's relative to the history of the Celtic tradition, which is one of the kind of foundational influences on Halloween. So we know that thoughts are things, and that as we anticipate and prepare for and participate in an event, especially if it's happened for hundreds of years or thousands of years, it actually creates a field of consciousness. And so we thought we'd start with the history of Halloween, so we have some background to it, and we'll bring in that Celtic influence again. So the Celtic holiday was the original Halloween, and it was for them the time that the calendar ended. And it was also the time in between years, which is quite interesting. So their harvest time was ending. It was a celebration that, they're going to thrive throughout the winter and not go hungry, hopefully. And for some reason, they believed that the veil between the two worlds was the thinnest this time of year. And they had perhaps it was, ending of the calendar and then, kind of a rebirth of the year. I hadn't found that in the history that I've read. But one of the things they did do was they kept fires going that night to keep the spirits away from the living, because they believed the veil was the thinnest. So what happened, of course, was the church appropriated that holiday, and as they've done with not only the Celtic traditions but the pagan traditions, and they turned it into All Hallowed Saints Eve. That's where Halloween originally got its name. And it went through a period of history where it sort of devolved into tricks. That's where the trick or treat thing came from. And people were doing property damage. And if you didn't give a treat that somebody liked, they started off with stealing the gate to your house, and then they would maybe do more things. And so there's some history there around the thought forms of tricks, scaring yourself and others because of the, it kind of devolved into more tricks than trick-or-treating. And there's a consciousness field around, the trick or treat, the doing some, mayhem, the veil is the thinnest between the worlds, keeping, the spirits away with light. And, these things have to evolve over time. So that's I wouldn't say that's a world-class history lesson, but that gives us a place to start.
Well, I certainly have experienced the consciousness field around Halloween related to treats. That is the one time a year I like to eat candy. I just feel like I should eat candy.
Yeah, it feels like
It's
a
that.
moral obligation to eat as much candy as you can.
I mean, I guess that's a combination of consciousness field and just childhood experience too. Um,
Yeah,
that
did you used to go around with a pillowcase when you were trick or treating, or would you use?
yeah, the bigger the better.
Yeah, pillowcase. You could put it over your shoulder like that hobo look.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So that's definitely part of the feed consciousness field around this is the treats part of it.
yeah, absolutely. It's been commercialized, where it's
Hmm.
more about how much. Well, for a kid anyway, it's how much candy can you get. There was a time when that was the thing, right?
Well, I
How,
noticed this year in August, the stores were already showing Halloween candy
yeah,
for sale.
yeah. They usually about 90 days out. They start advertising the next cycle of
So, what about
consumerism.
Day of the Dead, Clayton? It's kind of in the same time frame.
Yeah, it's when we were doing the brief history that felt relative to our conversation. We were curious if the Day of the Dead had some of the same influences, and it really isn't. I mean, there's a real clear distinction between the history of Halloween and the history of praying for the deceased ancestors and loved ones. There's like a
Mm,
thought form of appreciation, a field of love and
mm,
acknowledgement of
mm,
support from the ancestors, and it's a relatively high consciousness, kind of perspective, and it's celebrated with joy. The little that I've seen of it when I've been to Mexico, it's
mm,
just a very different experience where Halloween is kind of edgy. It's
mm,
like, well, you might want to, if you're going to pull out your inner trickster, Halloween is one of the days you can likely get away with it. Whereas the Day of the Dead has a quite a, I mean, that's fun too, playing around with stuff, obviously. But the Day of the Dead is kind of a celebration and has a lot of reverence to it. It's quite different.
So, I assume the Day of the Dead holiday then is a higher consciousness holiday or higher consciousness time than Halloween. I
Yes,
assume so.
yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. If you measure the level of consciousness of the culture on Halloween evening, so a culture that has a really really big tradition of Halloween, if you measure the level of consciousness of the country on that night, Halloween typically will drop the level of
Mm,
consciousness,
mm.
or that influence will drop it, and the Day of the Dead raises it.
Oh,
Now we haven't done a lot of research on how many points, and that might be interesting, especially for a numbers geek. But just to say that one drops it and the other one raises it, so
mhm.
that's interesting.
Well, during the time of Halloween, there's a lot of talk about ghosts and ghost
Yeah.
stories and spirits. So, what are spirits and disembodied beings? We can talk about what we believe they are, and it's really a multi-dimensional or an interdimensional conversation. Um, and we're not experts in this. We don't know, don't understand all of the dimensions, but we can talk from what we believe and what we know. Um, and so, from my point of view, there's other dimensions that are normally sort of not apparent to us, with our normal senses of ears and sight
Hmm.
and hearing. But we've talked in other episodes and in this one about thought forms and fields of consciousness. And, there seems to be, maybe a multidimensional aspect to that. And that beings in these other dimensions could exist. And we'll talk about some examples of how that can affect us in this normal kind of what we think of as the normal dimension. Um, and we are very sensitive to through feelings, emotions, intuitive senses, and some think it may be partly through the pineal gland as like a third eye or third
Hmm.
sight. Any thoughts on the pineal gland? We can always come back to that in another episode.
Yeah, the pineal gland's a big conversation. It's definitely associated with going between the veils, if you want to refer to it as that, or transcending the veils consciously would be another way to say it. Some people use the word piercing the veils, but I don't necessarily like the piercing idea. There is, there are people that have the gift of second sight, as you call it, or other forms of intuition, and the pineal gland has a role with that. Yeah, absolutely. It's there's a lot of conversation, and in the personal development, spiritual community, different religious communities about the role of the pineal gland. The calcification of it, the decalcification of it, how to strengthen it. There's definitely a lot of training out there on that. And we've done a fair bit of research on it ourselves, Jeff, in terms of measuring, of course, the operational efficiency of the pineal gland, the structure of the pineal gland, because of its role in consciousness. Yeah, that's definitely, it's part of the influence.
So I'd like to talk about the ghost idea. So there's, disembodied beings, but there's also this idea, which I've heard of recently, about thought forms in a history on the land, or in a building or an object, that is almost like a movie being replayed over and over again. Which might be a little bit different than a disembodied being, or someone that's passed over and is in another dimension. But the idea of the land holding the memory of an event. So we talked in other podcasts about sort of the emotions and the thought forms. Have you heard about that, Clayten? This idea that sort of a replay of event, like the lady coming down the stairs. These kind of ghostly apparitions sometimes people see.
Yeah, one of the classic, or many of the classic ghost stories that I'm recalling, and many that we've researched for this, there seems to be a pattern of the disembodied entity having a habit of being in the same place. And we have a place right here in town, a hotel, where there's the daughter of one of the original owners of the hotel. Has changed hands a few times, and she's typically seen in the same place. And so it seems that when people are in between the worlds, there's often, but not always, a repetitive pattern that they have. And we have those when we're alive. If you're in the hotel, for example, like this person, you may go to a certain table in the restaurant that you liked, or you would go to a certain room in the hotel. Maybe you lived there for part of the time. So there's the pattern of behavior that existed while the person's alive. And then I think later on we're going to talk about being stuck in between the worlds and repeating an unconscious pattern where you're looking for something and not finding an answer, and you just keep looking, but you're not necessarily aware that you're looking. Now, again, we don't know exactly what these disembodied entities are thinking, but the pattern seems to be, in many cases, at least the ones that we've researched, that there's a repetitive, cyclical, physical location that they go through. And, it's hard to speculate whether that's conscious or unconscious, but it certainly seems that some of it is unconscious. Yeah, where they're kind of stuck in a loop.
So we've got, memories, thoughts, patterns kind of on the land or a building or on an object. And there's that crystalline structure we've talked about in other episodes that can hold the memory of what may have happened. And then we have disembodied beings, so perhaps human, doesn't have to be human, who passed over and somehow got attached or stuck, on a piece of land or a building or an object. So they're, in another dimension, perhaps, not clearly visible. So how would someone get stuck like that?
Well, one of the ways, and I think we have enough evidence around this one to state it as maybe a little more than an opinion, is one of the ways that people get stuck in between the worlds, or in between dimensions, or between the living and the light, we'll say, is and that's based upon the presupposition that going to the light, that's the historical context around passing over completely, is a more healthier form of existence for the evolution of the soul. There is an assumption there.
Mm.
And I think in our probably our personal lives, and according to our research, I would say that assumption is correct.
Mm.
It seems to restrict the soul's development when it doesn't transition from one world to another.
Mm.
At least for most of the time. It may not be all the time. It's our specialty is really creating high consciousness fields for all of us to live in, to optimize the conditions for the evolution of consciousness in an economized society. That's our mission and our specialty. And, when you're in that specialty, you have these other areas that you kind of bump up against because you're trying to create these optimal conditions. And if you come across disembodied spirits, then you have to find a way to manage that, to create the conditions that we want to live in.
Mm-hmm.
So
you mentioned patterns, that habits perhaps that someone had when they were alive, and you just now mentioned like an unhealthy attachment, or it could perhaps be with trauma. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah. So the example that comes to mind is, and I was exposed to this in a philosophical organization I was involved in. They talked about being very aware if you were going to purchase antiques.
Mm.
And so when I lived in Vancouver, there's a street called Granville Street. And that's where a lot of the antique shops were. And I was in this store looking at just sort of window shopping, more or less. And there was this lovely green wingback chair. It was quite sovereign looking. It was beautiful. Tongue and groove, wood joining, and the fabric was beautiful. And it was hundreds of years old, and it was in pristine condition. The fabric was, had a bit of wear in it, but it had a nice patina. It just looked very well cared for, very well made. And when I sat in it, it felt really uncomfortable. And apparently this chair had been on the floor for quite a while in this shop. And so that would be an example where later on, because you can always back test with kinesiology, we determined that there was somebody who was attached to that chair. So they might have, now we don't know the whole story of it, but somebody may have saved for that chair for 5 years. They maybe didn't have a lot of money, and they seen that chair and it meant something to them. And when they passed, well, so for example, what could it mean to them? So it could be the place that they were in the house, and that people deferred to them when they were in the chair because it was in the center of the home, and they were in a position of authority, perhaps, and they gained respect and esteem from that. And it was a pretty important part of their life to sit in that chair. I mean, we don't know that story in particular, but we can imagine something similar to that. It's maybe where they went in the evening and relaxed, and they look forward to that all day. It could have been where they passed. They could have passed over, or there could have, who knows what could have happened on the chair. But there was an energy in the chair that when you sat in it, you were not welcome. Like, you were not welcome in that chair. And that chair, I don't know if it's sold. I didn't sit in it again. So whatever the story is behind it, that's an example of some kind of inappropriate or unhealthy attachment. I mean, you've passed over. It's just a thing. But that thing meant so much to you that my opinion is that whoever owned that chair or maybe somebody wanted to be that person and they seen that person in a chair, and then when they passed over, they got attached to that chair because they wanted to be that person.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's an interesting, to speculate about why it was the way it was, but there was a couple of us who sat in the chair and I was like, I'm not sitting in that thing again. That's creepy. Like,
Yeah, would be really interesting to see what that looks like. You've got somebody sitting in the chair and then you sit on top of them, right, in another dimension. So
yeah, if you had some kind of screen that could show all that, that'd be cool.
someday science will
Someday.
see this. So this repeated commitment, repeated like use of the chair, attaching significance to the chair. So it builds an energy field, as we've talked about in other episodes, where, that's going to becomes like a reservoir, and we'll talk more about that later. But it becomes an energy field around that chair. And then in that passing over process, the person with their free will was attached in an unhealthy way, which interrupted the passing over process.
Yeah. That's an unhealthy attachment. It's a classic. It's just a very real example that any of us could imagine. I think doing is just sitting in a chair that was somebody's favorite possession or a coveted possession, we'll say.
Yeah. So this idea of the passing over process getting interrupted, that's just really interesting to me. It's not something I think about very much. And, I don't know how many people do. Are you aware of traditions around, and I've heard of some, but are you aware of, you studied any traditions around sort of consciously passing over or that process?
Yeah, there was a time when some friends of mine were involved in some people I worked with, a friend of theirs had passed over, and there's some things that happened in that process that they were very upset about. For example, the body ended up going to the mortuary because the estate hadn't been planned properly, and so if the estate isn't planned, there's a default, and there's a funeral home that I went to where the mortician was, and they felt like they lost control of the body. They wanted to have an open casket in the house, and because they didn't plan ahead, the person who passed, they lost control of it. So they ended up creating a service where they would help people prepare part of their will and how they wanted the body to be handled, and et cetera, et cetera. And that led, because I knew them, that led to a lot of conversations about preparing to pass. And so I was redoing my will at the time, so I took that into consideration. And I also read a little bit about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because that was the highest consciousness book I could find at the time on the process of passing. And I can't remember what the level of consciousness of the book was. And in that tradition, they spend years training to die. And for them, it isn't about, it is about where the body goes, because they want it left alone for a certain period of time. But it was more about the process of training yourself to die. Because they believe so much in reincarnation, I think that process of passing over and making it to the next dimension or next phase of existence was more important to them than in many of our Western cultures. Some people believe there's nothing after this life. And in their tradition, it's a very integral part of their whole belief system. They actually will, go and look for and find the next Dalai Lama, for example, or the next spiritual leader when the one that's living passes. So it's very imbued into everything they do, and they have a huge tradition around it, and rituals and ceremonies and all kinds of processes that they do.
So you mentioned going to the light. So that's part of these traditions are you pass over, and people that have near-death experiences, I've studied that quite a bit.
Yeah.
That can be that's a common theme of like the tunnel and the light. But you had said something about going, which light to go to. Like there's something that you had about that was really interesting to me when we talked about it before this episode.
Yeah. There's a few of us here that would remember the name Art Bell. We're kind of dating ourselves. But there was a time when Art Bell had Coast to Coast AM. He was the host. And I think I suffered insomnia for probably about 2 or 3 years listening to Art Bell late at night. And he had a real fascination with passing over and the spirit world. And at that time, I wasn't able to use kinesiology, but I sort of developed some frameworks around it. And then my mother actually died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. And she came back to life. She was, I wouldn't say reborn, but she were able to bring her back. Mm-hmm. And, she talks about that experience as one of the highlights of her life. It was such an extraordinary experience, the peace that she felt and the calmness. And she talks about the light being the brightest thing you could imagine, So when we were doing research with kinesiology around that, we determined it was important to go to the light that represents divinity or the highest truth that you can imagine. There is a theory out there that not all forms of light are the highest truth when you're passing over. So that would be my suggestion when it comes that time for any of us here to go, if we believe in divinity or God or, whatever language you use for that. There's so many ways to describe it. Universal consciousness, that you go to the light that represents that or the highest truth you can imagine. And that is a form of conscious protection for you in that process.
So in FLFE, and that for those of you that are new to the podcast, that's Focus Life Force Energy, and that's the business. It's a service that we created to activate a high consciousness field. So it creates a high consciousness environment, and of course you can create a high conscious environment in other ways, and pilgrimage sites and places where there's prayer and positive energies. So how do you think, Clayten, that a high field or a high consciousness area could support this passing over process? Not being attached or stuck or going to the wrong light.
First of all, when you're in a high consciousness field, your personal level of consciousness goes up over time. I think we talked about that just last night in a webinar. The average person on the FLFE service, if they're in the FLFE field 24/7 for 90 days, the average person goes up 30 points on the Hawkins map of consciousness. So we're using the Hawkins map of consciousness, which is determined through muscle testing or kinesiology, to quantify these fields and measure and adjust them accordingly. So, if you're in a high consciousness field long enough, your level of conscious will go up. You have free will, of course. So, like we oftentimes say, Jeff, that you can go. Your level of conscious can go down in a high consciousness field. You just have to work very, very, very hard at it because you have free will, right?
Right. You can be as crabby as you want to be.
You can be as crabby as you want to be, and so your personal level of consciousness would go up, and then you're in a high consciousness field, so you're less likely to be attached to that chair, whatever that chair is in your life. Maybe it's your car, maybe it's your house, there seems to be a distinction between having a commitment to your loved ones and wanting to support them from the other side, which is an act of love. If you're trying to control them from the other side, that's an act of attachment. But an act of love would be to support them. And there seems to be a there seems to be a capacity if a person has that intention and perhaps a high enough level of consciousness, because people with more with a higher level of consciousness have more power, really,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
that positivity provides an energy that has more versatility and capacity in it to do more things, whereas anger tends to short circuit everything. And
Mm-hmm.
although there's a lot of energy in anger, it doesn't seem to be the quality of energy that allows people to positively support those in this dimension from another dimension. So that's probably worth saying.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that the higher level of conscious you are, the more options you have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I've certainly noticed, that I'm attracted to different writings than I have been in the past, and especially when you read Dr. David Hawkins and all his books,
Mm-hmm.
they seem to go up in consciousness through the books, and some of the later ones, I can hardly comprehend them at all. Can't
Yeah.
put two sentences together and understand it. But I get attracted to ones that I think was the level where I am. So that being attracted to studying these higher truths and and perhaps higher conscious materials on passing over would also be helpful as you rise in consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't. I know that Dr. Hawkins talks about the astral realm. I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
recall. I mean, I've read the books, and I can't say I comprehended all of them either. I've read them all, well, except for the Book of Slides. I've only skimmed that, but I've read the rest of them, most of them, quite a few times. I don't think he really. Well, actually, yeah. Other than a few mentions of different dimensions, like the astral realm, and
Mm-hmm.
then measuring. See, different people have different definitions of the different dimensions. That's why you
Mm-hmm.
really have to become an expert in it, and then um, have your not necessarily your own, but have a set of definitions that have been professionally vetted. For example,
Mm-hmm.
on what is like, there's different traditions where they talk about the bardo, the astral realm. There's a
Mm-hmm.
gentleman on Gaia right now that talks about, I think it's 9 dimensions, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
And his
Mm-hmm.
teachings seem to be pretty high. He's a relatively young man. And he
Mm-hmm.
claims that he remembers those teachings from a previous incarnation. Now, wherever he got them from, they actually test pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
And we knew somebody also that was probably the highest person I've met in teaching about dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one of those areas where there hasn't been, in our tradition anyway, the level of research and verification on the traditions related to passing over and how that is connected to dimensions. Whereas a
Mm-hmm.
Tibetan Book of the Dead, that's, there's, I don't know how many years or generations of history, so it's pretty
Mm-hmm.
refined.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting realm to study. Interesting topic.
Yeah, it seems very important to our lives, in the passing over process. But also, we've got a lot of stories from FLFE, which
Yeah.
we'll talk about that. Where things happen, where there's an effect on this physical world that we live in from another dimension, and beings, disembodied beings being stuck there, attached in some ways. That it's the more we know about it, the better. The more that we can help others that are in that situation, and maybe keep ourselves from getting there ourselves. Um,
Yeah. Well, you want to tell us one of those stories, Jeff? I mean, there's a couple that,
yeah, I'd love to. Uh, they're so interesting when they're happening. They sort of unfold in real time with FLFE or Focus Life Force Energy customers. So these are subscription customers. They're on the service. A high consciousness field is activated in their homes. And then sometimes we get feedback from them about, well, it feels really great most of the time, but then once in a while it doesn't. And then we do research, might be historical research, intuitive work, and then kinesiology These stories emerge, and we really can test them using kinesiology. So we had one as a customer who became an employee, and it was a periodic feeling in the house of cold and sort of yuckiness, and it was in a certain part of the house. And it was maybe once or twice a week this would happen, and the rest of the time the house felt great. So when we did the kinesiology measurement, we noticed during that time that she mentioned the level of consciousness dropped. It dropped pretty far down. So something was going on. So once we looked into it, we did this process, kinesiology and intuitive work and history. The story emerged of a young man, literally 1,000 years before, who was in a battle situation, and he saw his parents being taken away, like kidnapped by the other group, and he was killed right at that moment. Like maybe hit in the back of the head. He didn't see it coming, and he didn't realize he was dead. And he's tracking his parents. So he's following these tracks. He's on a path. He's angry, he's scared, he's, vengeful. And this tracking pattern sort of went through around the neighborhood. And then it went back through this house. It was like the same pattern over and over, like we talked about. It was like the chair. It was kind of a pattern that kept repeating over and over. And every time he came through that property, it felt that way. It felt, low consciousness and yucky, and sort of there was a cold feeling too. And can you imagine 1,000 years in that same pattern, in that same like angry state? Oh, it's kind of sad.
Yeah, that was a weird one. It was right at the person. I remember because I went to the person's house, and it was right by the closet. There was a closet that the energy kind of showed up in, and that there was we concluded that there was some type of underwater, so underground influence there, where there was water dripping off rocks underneath the ground, like very large boulders. And we think the dropping of the water, sometimes water running, also creates a negative energy or pulls energy away from an environment. So there could have been a couple of other things, supporting that influence or contributing to it.
Yeah, perhaps amplifying that influence of that person walking through. And we'll talk a little bit later about what happened, after the FLFE service went on and what we did. So we had a story about some customers in an old building. You remember that one, Clayten?
Yeah, that was. I remember the property. I'm sort of looking at it in my mind on Google Earth, right? Because if we have, I guess we have a commitment in FLFE, the property is going to be at. Well, now it's the properties go on at 550 on the Hawkins map, but it was 560 before. We just adjusted a little bit. There's a slider you can use to move the consciousness up and down, but it's at the level we promise or higher 98% of the time, or you get it for free. And so if we find a property that isn't at level, we do research on it and we use Google Earth. And so I'm just imagining this property on Google Earth, and there was an old building on the property, and it hadn't been torn down. And at times the level of conscious on the property would drop, and people that were there, they would notice it and they felt really uncomfortable, and they asked us to look into it. So we started looking into it, and again through a combination of we have a process. We go through this kinesiology to measure the variables of what's going on in the property, and then there's oftentimes thoughts that we get about it, and then we measure the source of those thoughts to verify that it's an integrous intuition. There's a process to all that, and it's pretty detailed and very well managed from the kinesiology point of view. And the conclusion to that was that there was a family that used to live on the land, and there was 3 brothers, and they had this pact between them, and they swore that they would protect the land.
Mm.
Because I think at some point someone was trying to take the land from them and their family, and they swore that they would protect it. And when they passed over, their pact was so strong, and they've been doing it for so long, they just kept doing it. And they would try to run people off the land. And it was just like sitting down in that chair. It's like, wow, I'm not sitting in that chair again, And whatever these guys were able to do on the other side, people would not want to be on that land. And it's an interesting story. It seems to be how it happens. You had this long-standing commitment for decades, perhaps, and you have multiple people involved in this case. And be careful what you commit to.
So what was committed to in that FLFE office bathroom situation? Can you tell us about that? I didn't experience that personally, but I know you did.
That was a weird one, man. It was our second office we moved into. It was the old Chamber of Commerce building in Nelson, and it was sold to a dentist. Nice man. And we'd moved in there and we'd renovated it, and we were, doing business, and there was this weird feeling in the men's bathroom, and couldn't figure out what was going on. So, we should, let's say, eat your own medicine or take your own medicine. So we started doing research on it, and we developed this process because we've checked thousands and thousands of properties, right? So we go through this process and we check that part of the property, and sure enough, there's something in the bathroom where it's a low consciousness energy. And in fact, sometimes low consciousness fields, they smell funny, and in bathrooms you can imagine it's smelling funny because obviously you go to the bathroom there. But there was something else going on. So what we determined was that there was a woman who was in the business community back in the early days of the chamber, and that she felt she was mistreated by, I think, by the men in the community, in the Chamber of Commerce. And so when she passed over, she was so infuriated with how she was treated, she ended up staying in the men's bathroom of the Chamber of Commerce. And whenever a guy went in there and was about to do his business, as soon as your belt buckle came undone, you get this really weird feeling, and you feel very self-conscious and awkward. And and even there was this one woman in our office who was quite sensitive, and she felt something really weird in the women's bathroom because they're right next to each other. They shared a wall, and she didn't even want to go to the bathroom there. So that was kind of a weird one. I won't tell you the exact thoughts that you typically had, but it was really, really uncomfortable.
Oh, come on, Clayten.
Yeah. No, we'll save that one for another day.
For a private conversation. All right.
Yeah, for a private conversation.
You meet us somewhere in person. We'll talk to you.
Yeah.
So, the high consciousness field of FLFE and the other benefits of that environment. So it's affecting these beings, and we can, talk a little bit about, they're affecting us through their level of consciousness, maybe their intentions, like this, the thoughts that they're thinking are affecting us. And, for example, that young man tracking his parents, that angry, vengeful, worried feeling was really affecting the level of consciousness, the field of consciousness there in probably the whole route, of course, that he was on. So it may have gone through other houses, down the street. Who knows, what other people were experiencing. So how does this energy help, having a high consciousness field there? How does it help them to, become, either not attached or to move on to the light?
Yeah, I mean, we get a lot of customers asking us these type of questions. And so one of the themes that comes up is that if you have a high consciousness field on a property, does it automatically force people to pass over that are stuck? It's like, no, it doesn't.
Mm.
And there's lots of people, I don't say lots, but there are people who will do ceremonies and place objects on a land where they feel there's a disembodied spirit, if we want to use that language.
Mm-hmm.
So if we didn't know how to manage that environment in the bathroom, for example, at the office, we could have called somebody in and they would have done a ceremony and they would have maybe placed an object there. And that is creating a high consciousness field. And there's no there's no request in our field to force anybody to do anything. We're trying to help raise the level of consciousness and create more freedom. So that's probably just worth saying in the beginning, is that if you're working with anybody that's trying to help deal with a disembodied spirit that you would like to have not be there, or like to have their influence be different. I mean, it was amazing to me in the bathroom that there was a certain theme of thought, and it was like the same theme all the time, but changed a bit. And and for that, I think it was Jennifer who had that young Native man on the land, which there was a theme of thought. Sometimes the thoughts were different, but there was a real theme to it. Mm-hmm. If you're working with somebody to change that theme, you really want them to, say my opinion, you don't want them to try to force anybody to do anything. Mm-hmm. You want to offer that being more energy to be conscious about what it's doing. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to energize this negativity, and a high conscious field won't do that, right? Because a high conscious field, negativity is diminished. Mm-hmm. So I think that's worth saying.
So it's more like a blessing than, say, a banishing.
Yeah, exactly.
So in the blessing and the blessing of whatever is the ceremony, or in the FLFE mm-hmm. energy that's there, the disembodied becomes maybe less distracted, less focused on that obsession, and maybe can start to look around and realize that they're not alive.
Yeah, and to support them to find the highest consciousness truth that they can find to make that transition. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really not for us to say what other people do, mm-hmm. but it isn't for us to try to entrap people and force them. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think you've said that well, Jeff. It's not banishment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so then as they increase in consciousness, their options are increased, their freedom mm-hmm. is increased. They can look around, they can look for other paths. But I can just imagine, boy, you've been in a pattern for 1,000 years, and all of a sudden you realize it's a pattern and it's not, that it's not really what's happening. It could be very uncomfortable, I would think. But in that process of more freedom, more options, higher energy, because I think some of these situations, it feels like the energy is so low, mm-hmm. maybe they're like in suicides, you often hear about yes. There's just a very low despair energy, and it's pretty mm-hmm. hard to do anything in that energy. I think, we know that in physical form, and I'll bet it's true in another dimension, that it's really would be hard to take action to go to the light, if that were what you wanted to do. So having a high consciousness field then helps there to be more energy available for that person to evolve and grow and have more options, like we said.
Yeah, I mean, we know if you've been around if you've been around long enough, or you've lived long enough, we've all seen our own challenges as a living being who's on a conscious path, that we have a hard enough time changing the way we are sometimes. Mm-hmm. And if you're young and you've been brought up in an environment of fear and anger and vengefulness, and you get into a situation where, or maybe there might be other ways that would contribute to you being stuck, but it's not that, I don't think it's that big of a leap to imagine how that could happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yep. Yep. We run into all sorts of people, and we're personally stuck in some areas of our lives, and that's one of the things about being in a high consciousness field or environment is, starting to have more options and be less stuck and have the energy to choose a different thought or a different set of actions, when something occurs.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of a sad topic to go into,
Mm-hmm.
but it's so I have a lot of compassion for people, entities that are stuck in those places for those periods of time. I mean, that
Mm-hmm.
must be horrible.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's bless them all.
Yeah.
So what on the positive side, what about relics? I hear about relics every once in a while. Like I think you had mentioned the Buddha relics to me one time.
Yeah, there's a lot of traditions have the relics that they call them. Sometimes it's clothing, sometimes it's jewelry, sometimes it's the bones. In some traditions, they burn the body and they assess the level of consciousness of the person who passes by the number of. Because they take the ashes and they sift through them, and there's when a high consciousness person, apparently there's these little marble-like um, accumulations that are left after the body's burned,
Hmm.
and the number and size of these I don't know what to call them. I call them an accumulation. That's not a very good word for it, but that'll do. Whatever they are, these residues that are left over, the number and size of them indicate the level of conscious of the person.
Mm,
So,
interesting.
and those hold the energy of the person.
Mm,
Those those little marble-like leftovers. And I'd heard about the Buddhist relics when I lived in Vancouver, British Columbia. They were at University of British Columbia, so when they came to town, I made a point to go to them, and I went. I went probably in the first 2 or 3 days they were in town. I'm sure they were in town for a couple of weeks, and the experience I had was just extraordinary.
mm,
And I was just getting into kinesiology at the time, and I measured some of the relics of the Buddha himself. So there was all these different saints. It was a big auditorium, and there was all these relics encased in like plexiglass or glass cases. And there was a rope between you and the relic, and some of them were the robes of saints.
mm,
And they seemed to have a variety of different people with different qualities. Like this saint was known for this, and this monk was known for this, and this monk was known for that. So it had a variety of different kind of energetic signatures, if you will, or imprints. And they had something from the Buddha. Now I can't remember if it was a piece of bone, and some of this is kind of morbid, or if it was that leftover residual marble-like ingot. There's a technical name for it. Um, but what I do remember is how I felt in that auditorium and how everybody
mm,
else reacted. It was an extraordinary experience.
mm.
Some of the Buddhist relics calibrated at 910 out of 1,000 on the Hawkins map of consciousness,
Wow,
and they're thousands of years old.
that's very
So
high.
that's
Hmm.
extraordinary.
Hmm.
And I went back like as much time as I could spend in that room when they were there. And I started calling on my friends. And at that time, I had an active coaching practice, and a lot of people were local. And I said, this is an opportunity that's not going to happen very often. I don't know how long, often these relics are going to come through. If you can make it there, and there was other people telling other people, and soon that auditorium was pretty full, and it was full. Like people were standing, and just to be in the presence of that energy, it was
Mm,
extraordinary.
hmm.
Yeah, it was
So it
something.
was a field of consciousness around those relics, whatever they were. And did you notice some of the other ones? Like they must have been a different field of consciousness around, a different saint that has maybe some property or some high aspect about them. Did you notice other ones as well? Was there some different characteristics?
Yeah, the assumption that we had, because we were trying to speculate as to why they would arrange these relics in this order. And we did talk to some people who were traveling with the relics. And my recollection is that they were trying to find a person who had, and in our terminology, Jeff, would have a really high level of conscious in one part of life. Mm-hmm. Like this person was great with eating food that was really nutritious for them. They just were really clean about that. And they were at peace with it. They didn't judge other people for what they did, but they were great with their diet. Always were, or they worked at it. Maybe they always were, maybe they really worked at it. Other people were really physically fit and quite a high level of consciousness. Some people were really a high level of consciousness and they were really social. That was their gift. And some were maybe very studious, or some were really good at repeating mantras, or some were really good at writing. And so they seemed to try to pick people that had this specialized gift or trained discipline. And they wanted to create like that, that experience where you could maybe get whatever you were low in. That was, kind of an assumption. I could never talk to anybody. Like there was I don't know if they called abbots. I can't remember what they were called. There was people that were traveling with the relics that were in the Tibetan Buddhist lineage, or in the Buddhist lineage. I think some were Tibetan. There might have been others. We could see them in the robes, but they didn't really speak English, and they had some interpreters, and it was just hard to get their attention and ask them questions. So we did talk. A few of us had asked questions, and it was probably thinking this is 18 years ago, so my memory is not great on it. But I do remember the experience. I just don't remember all the details of why it was set up.
Wow, that's really extraordinary. I'd love to find that traveling event and go see it. It's like an upgrade across all those different aspects of consciousness, through all those different fields of consciousness in that room. I mean, they're all kind of upgrading you. Did you feel different, after spending time there?
Oh yeah. I mean, I was going literally every day. It was just about how much of the day I was spending there. I mean, anything that wasn't any commitment I didn't have that was, I couldn't get out of because they weren't going to be there that long. I was canceling everything.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you feel like a lasting benefit after that?
That's interesting. I'd have to go back and measure my level of consciousness before that and after. But I would have, I would have to say, like, I couldn't tell you that, when I went and seen the Buddhist relics, or when I visited like 30 times in the week or whatever, I've spent 30 hours in the week with it, that this part of my life changed, But I imagine that anybody that spent time in those fields would change. I don't know how you wouldn't. It would just be like how much you would change, I suppose. I mean, some of us will never be exposed to that field in our entire lifetime. Most of us probably. I mean, who gets to be around a 9-10 energy field? So most of the time, there's not even one person on the planet that's at 9-10 out of 1,000. Yeah.
Well, we have some aspects of energy in the FLFE environment from sacred sites.
Yeah, we definitely attempt to reassign energy from the sacred sites into the environment, or associate the energy with those. And but anybody listening to this now or at any time in the future, if you can spend time at the Buddhist relics, I would suggest it.
So in the spirit of Halloween in my orange shirt,
yes,
let's talk about curses, because there's this disembodied stuck beings we've been talking about, but curses seem to be something different. How would we define curses?
Well, I was flipping through the TV channels years ago, and I don't watch a lot of TV. I watch movies, but not a lot of TV. And I flipped onto this channel, and they were talking about curses. And I learned more about curses in the next 2 minutes than I'd learned before that, and I'd studied it a little bit. I didn't realize that. So first of all, the way we talked about defining curses, Jeff, when we were planning this, and we really, a decent definition of a curse is a negative thought expressed or held in mind. It's either expressed verbally or held in mind and typically repeated. Mm-hmm. So it would be a negative mantra, I guess some people would say. And in that television program, when I turned it on, they were talking about curses, and this person said, the biggest form of curses in today's world is the negative thoughts we have about ourselves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And wow, you have my attention. So I watched that. It was a religious show. Mm-hmm. So that's when I think I feel like I understood curses differently than that I had before. I thought, there was a time in society when people put curses on other people, and that's still happening, of course, and we'll talk more about that. But that was a level of subtlety and everyday experience that I just really didn't appreciate before I heard that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just didn't get it.
These stories we tell ourselves, cursing ourselves, for I can't do this or can't do that. So a curse, I'll kind of extend the definition a little bit. As you said, it's kind of said over and over again. It's a repeated phrase used over an extended period of time. So it creates a reservoir of negativity that then the curse seems to draw from, and it's directed towards a person, place, or thing. So there's this reservoir of negative energy kind of attached to that person, place, or thing. Go ahead, Clayten.
Yeah, it seems to be that the strength of the curse relates to the how it's repeated and how it's connected to that negative energy. Maybe you were going there. I just wanted to mention that even if it's not repeated over a long period of time, a negative thought still has an effect. It's just that curses tend to be associated with an ongoing negative thought that's repeated and energized.
And the flip side would be a blessing, like we were talking about, a blessing for disembodied beings that are stuck, or blessing for someone that you are close to, which can also be repeated and create a reservoir of positive energy.
Yeah, I think that when people, for example, do a certain prayer, like I'm just seeing in my mind somebody doing a rosary, or doing prayers on a rosary, and there's, it's very possible that there are people praying with a rosary 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I mean, maybe not as much as there used to be because traditions have changed, but there's a lot of time zones in the world, and some traditions still use rosaries, and people pray. They have a time of day when they pray. It's very possible there could be 24/7 energy of praying on a rosary. So there would be a blessing field associated with that. So when you start to pray, you kind of fall, you not say fall, but you relax into that habit that you have on your own in the history of the prayer. Yeah.
You might actually rise rather than fall. Yeah. In consciousness with that thought field.
Yes.
I've noticed that with chants, Sanskrit chants, like in a kirtan situation, and seems to be a lot of energy on those chants, and they've been around for thousands of years, some of them. And so I guess that's another example of that reservoir of positive energy building, and there might be a temple associated with that chant, a place where it's actually being held. And then when you chant that, you're tapping into that energy.
Yeah, you're contributing to it and receiving from it. Yeah, and sometimes there's a particular saint associated with the chant, or non-corporeal being, or non-corporeal being. I think that's the way to say it. Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomena.
So it's perhaps multidimensional, or like a quantum association. Particularly if there was a temple associated with a particular chant, then there's that instant connection. When you chant, you're really opening up a field like FLFE opens up or activates a field through the quantum association with the system and the location. So, yeah, I believe that chants work in a similar way. You're activating a field that's around you, and what the characteristics, I guess, would be around the thoughts and intentions and beliefs, around that chant.
Yeah. I think there's something else that's worth saying here. I think the highest possibility for us interacting as humans is to hold other people and ourselves in the possibility of being reborn at any moment. And by that I mean that we're consciously holding a space for others to transcend the challenges that we have and the limitations that we have, those imposed on us by others, but mostly those imposed on us by ourselves. And I know in FLFE we have these requests to divinity in this space. We call them programs. And we do make that request to divinity that we are able to see each other renewed in every moment in such a way that we can transcend our limitations. And that's a pretty high order for a person to hold for themselves or others. Just because we're talking about blessings, I think that's worth saying. That would be one of the highest, if not the highest, possibilities.
Yeah, it's holding the blessing for freedom, for increased freedom and joy and options in their life. Transcendence. I love the way we may get onto a dark subject, but we tend to take it to the positive side. It's just how we see life.
Yeah.
And these curses, as we're saying, there's a reservoir of positive energy and a blessing, and some of these technologies, you could say, like chants. And it seems that the general positivity and holding these blessings for each other, for ourselves, and being in a high field can dissipate the negative energy of a curse.
Yes. A high consciousness field, whether it's created internally from us as individuals, or we draw upon a reservoir of energy that's created by other individuals and ourselves, perhaps, such as a pilgrimage site. And there are emerging technologies like FLFE or focused light force energy that can create high consciousness fields. These high fields dissipate negativity. Absolutely. And then there's specific, it's not an area of expertise for us how to remove a curse or dispel negativity necessarily. But yeah, these mantras, these chants, these prayers, yeah, they would definitely dissipate negativity. I would assume that if you were really into this sort of field of study, that you would be able to correlate a negative experience in the outside of your life with a positive affirmation, prayer, mantra, kirtan, song in your inner world to dispel that. There's probably a correlation that's able to be measured. It's just not something we have any really much expertise in.
Yeah, we're coming to the part of our discussion where we talk about, what some takeaways, perhaps. Certainly the cursing yourself one really struck me as you said that, where kind of looking at ourselves and our thought patterns. And in other podcasts, we've talked about sort of those, unconscious thoughts that we might have, and some which may be ours and some which may not be ours, that are part from the environment or from societal thought forms. But, so I guess the takeaway is examining what our stories are and what we're repeating to ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Jeff. It's we believe we can certainly measure to some degree where thoughts come from through kinesiology, and for me, I'm going to be a little more cognizant of what possibility I'm holding for other people.
Mm.
I mean, we work with some pretty great people in the office, and when we get on to a really interesting topic and see everybody light up, you really see the beauty, or if they're passionate about something and they're just really shiny. It's easy to see them as powerful, free, sovereign beings and a spark of the divine in those moments. And when, it's just when there's things that you want other people to be doing for you as an employer and they're not able to do it, that's when it's harder to hold that possibility. So I think that could probably, there's probably something there for all of us, just with our family and friends. I mean, we tend to take for granted the people that are closest to us because we spend so much time around them. I think the term is familiarity on the negative side, right? Yeah.
Yeah, holding, first of all, awareness. What are the thoughts that I've got? That my thoughts are not, they're still creating the reality around me. And really consciously holding that possibility for everyone to transcend whatever's theirs to, for them to work on wherever their edges are, and just hold everyone in the story of joy and that shiny, as you just said, like that shiny lit up, excitement of something they really love to be involved with and be doing.
Yeah, and I guess maybe the last thought on this for me anyway is another takeaway could be exploring the passing over process and being comfortable with that in yourself as to how you want to manage that if it's not something you've studied yet. So that's another possible takeaway.
Yeah, I'd personally like to work on that.
Yeah,
that one.
So I think it's time to say goodbye to your orange shirt, Jeff, for today. Is that time?
Yeah, I'm sure it'll show up at some Halloween parties coming up. So.
Yeah, got to get. It's like those Christmas songs. We wear them at Christmas, right? They have like the little elves on them, or Santa Claus, reindeers.
It was great being with you, Clayten, and having this discussion at this time of year. It's there's a lot going on with Halloween and the Day of the Dead, and it's really it's been fun to dig into this.
Yeah, it's we spend so much time talking about consciousness. It's nice to find a topic that we haven't really researched very much and connect, like with Halloween, the Day of the Dead, and look at the history and the traditions. That's been fun. Yeah. Thank you for joining Fields of Consciousness, the podcast of consciousness conversations. We invite you to visit the link below the episode to experience a completely free trial of Focused Life Force Energy for 15 days.
If you like, you can subscribe to the Fields of Consciousness podcast, and please tune in again next time. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesdays at 11:11 a.m. PST. Onward and upward.